I mean, at least in the US, people seem to be thoroughly distracted by democracy, really, like the right to vote, as if that is an adequate mechanism to correct some of these issues, right? If you don't like the way the government's treating you, you just vote in another guy or girl, and that somehow is a fix. But it doesn't address the incentive problems, right? There's this a great quote. I don't know who said it, but referring to democratic elections, said that basically every public election is an advanced auction on stolen goods. So when someone comes into office for 4 or 8 years, right, they don't have a long term capital interest in the tax base necessarily. So their incentive is to just cut as many deals as possible to enrich themselves or those closest to them before they're booted out 4 to 8 years later. So what can I mean, it's such a pernicious problem because you got people with no education about real economics. We're steeped in this, I don't know, democracy being like the holy grail of governance systems, and it's not, right? It's got its own incentive problems. And like you said, people don't understand money. So it's almost like they don't understand how the game is played. So they're getting played. So what, I mean, other than this educational work we're trying to do, is there something more systemic we could attempt? Is there another approach we should be thinking about to rectify this? Like, how do you view this problem and trying to approach it usefully?
Well, one of the problems is that you have to go back. This is very difficult. You have to go back to first principles and think about what democracy actually was conceived as being. And so you have to go back to Athens, 2000 years ago, 1500 years ago, whatever. You have to go right back to the concept of democracy. Now, the democracy we have today was never what was intended. And in fact, the democracy we have today is a rather new phenomenon. There was no idea that democracy would be a head count, that everybody who arrived at the age of 18 or 21 or whatever it is gets a vote regardless of who they are or what they do. And if you tried to explain that to a man from Mars who didn't understand the system and he came down, he would stare in wonder at you. He would go, "You're kidding me. As soon as your birth certificate says you're a certain age, you get to vote regardless of what you contribute." It's crazy. It's absolutely madness. And of course, although the ancient Athenians didn't know the phrase, it's one of those wonderful American phrases which I love, which puts its finger right on the button. If you get a vote in the old Athenian days, you don't get a vote unless you had skin in the game.
Mm.
So you now have millions and millions of people who are voting to see which government will give them freebies.
Right.
And it's the same in all the Western democracies, not just at the Anglosphere. It's not just here in America. It's in the Western. I'm going to vote for this guy because he's promised he's going to give me something, so I'm voting for him. Now the something is stolen from somebody else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have any. He doesn't have anything. He doesn't have anything. He has to steal it from your neighbor. And now, of course, he's stolen so much money from your neighbor. Your neighbor doesn't have any money left, so he prints it, which degrades the currency, and so the whole charabang goes on. And when I was in a debate at Durham University a few years ago, it was a debate on tax, and I tried to explain to the undergraduates and the faculty who've had a problem understanding it, because frankly they're not very bright, that tax is theft, as Murray Rothbard said, but just think about it. What kind of theft is it? Now, in the old days, in the medieval days, the king, your medieval king in the 13th or 14th century, would take your castle, take your money, take your tithes. He would take all of that because he was the king. He was an honest thief. He stole from you because he was the king and he could, and he had swords and he had men to do it. All right. That's how it was in the Middle Ages. And it was the same all over Europe. That's what kings do, steal your money. Now, What we have today in a kleptocracy is politicians who steal your money. And what really annoys me is they pretend it's for your own benefit. And that really narks me. Now, theft is theft. Now, if somebody came up behind you one dark night and bashed you over the head and took your wallet, and as you were lying there on the pavement, blooded, if he then whispered in your ear as he took your wallet, "Don't worry, it's in a very good cause. I'm going to give it to my mother." You've still been robbed. The fact that he thinks it's going to a good cause has got nothing whatsoever to do with it. He's a thief. He's a thief. And of course, he takes a cut for himself. He might give it to his mother, but he's had his hand in the till before he gives it to his mother, and then a few mates. So all these people are thieves and crooks. But now here's the problem. In a democracy, we have a constitutional monarchy and a parliamentary democracy, not a million miles away to what you've got. You've got a not dissimilar kind of democratic system. Now, what we've got to understand is that the protection of that is the law. Your constitution. We have a constitution. It isn't documented or written in the same way that yours is, but it's a constitution nevertheless. And it was formulated in 1688. And one of the reasons for the American Revolution in 1776, because they weren't getting the protection of the Bill of Rights in 1688. And they said, just a minute, we're not getting any protection. We're not getting any protection. All right. And so they said, let's go our own way. And that's actually what happened. Now, you have law, all sorts of laws, principles of English law. Again, in Washington, you have a fair copy of Magna Carta, which was only encapsulating law, incidentally. A lot of people think that's where it began. It didn't. It began in Anglo-Saxon law. The concept, if you will, sometimes referred to as natural justice, which was an Anglo-Saxon concept, hundreds of years before Magna Carta. And that's developed over many, many years and many, many, many generations. And the principle of English law is some of the greatest principles in the history of law, globally, regardless. Now, that's been eaten away in the same way that your constitution has been eaten away. Nobody takes any notice of your constitution, and they don't take any notice of our constitution because it's overridden by politicians who just go around it and pretend it doesn't exist. And they've corrupted the legal system. So your judges are all political appointments. They are here now. They're all political appointments. So they go along with anything. They're not great lawyers. They don't get to the Supreme Court because they're fantastic lawyers with independent thinking and independent minds. They're there because they've been put there by a crook. Won't expose them. So you have the law, which has been degraded, totally degraded, the system of law in your country. Give an example of that is Julian Assange at the moment, held with a total suspension of habeas corpus. It is totally against the principles of English law to hold Julian Assange locked up in Belmarsh for years and years without charging him. You can't do that in English law. They've just torn it up and walked away. So that is the sort of problem that you get. They've taken all that away. They've corrupted the system. And here's the second string to the same bow, if you will. And that is one of the great protections was a free press. It was a free press. So the press should be saying, you can't do that. Here's our legal correspondent. You can't do that under the principles of English law, the Bill of Rights, or whatever it is, habeas corpus, the presumption of innocence, which is now gone if you're investigated by the tax revenue or the VAT people, or whatever tax people it may be. The concept of your innocence is gone. That's a fundamental principle of both your law and our law here. The principle of it, not on the mainland Europe, the principle of the presumption of innocence. You are presumed guilty now if it's a state investigation. You have to prove your innocence. And you have no protection by mainstream media, the newspapers, the television. That's all bought and paid for by the establishment. Another brilliant phrase that you came up with in America, deep state. And now, of course, it's not even deep state, it's oligarchs owning it, like Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, Bill Gates, who gives money to the BBC. The European Union gives money to the BBC, so that he who pays the piper calls the tune. All you get from BBC now is the deep state line. No dissent. It's the same on climate change. Nobody's allowed to come on television anywhere to say, just a minute, this is bullshit. Here are the graphs. Here's the data. This is a hoax. You can't get on TV. So 85% or 90% of the people in America and Great Britain probably think there's a climate emergency because they don't know any better. And all they do, most people, America's no different to here, they watch the television, they watch BBC News at 6 o'clock while they're half doing something else, they're preparing their tea, they're doing something and they're half looking. Nobody goes back and says, that doesn't sound right to me, I'm going to check it out. Most people in Great Britain believe everything that they see on the TV. And of course, then the newspapers back it up. So there's no access for information for these people. There's no concept of an inquiring mind. There's no concept of risk analysis with these people. And this, of course, is really what Hans Hopper in his book about democracy was trying to drive at. When you have a democratic system, you can manipulate 80% of the electorate because they're all stupid. So we get what the people vote for and how we change it, as I said, going right back to the Athenian concept of democracy, is to change the game. Nobody in the public sector gets a vote. Nobody in the public sector gets a vote because they're just going to vote for more public sector spending. If you're not in the wealth creating sector, you don't get a vote. You've got to be in the wealth creating sector and you've got to be a taxpayer. You've got to be a taxpayer. And then you would have, that would mean that at least half the electorate had a deep interest in what was going on and what money is and how much tax they're paying, so on and so forth. That is the way, genuine democracy. But we're wedded here. People, even in conservative people, the people on the right, are horrified if you suggest it isn't one man, one vote. And I make another analogy there to undergraduates and faculties. If you go to the pub in England or you go into a bar in America, let's say there's a dozen lads. It's a lads' night out, right? Everybody puts $50 into the kitty or whatever it is, okay, to pay for the booze. And you go from one bar to the next and a good time is had by all. Marvelous, love it. Now, if you don't put your $50 in, you don't get a drink because you're not in the kitty. And you wouldn't expect a drink, would you? You wouldn't expect it. You're not in the kitty. So you don't get a drink. And it's the same in society. If you don't put anything into the kitty, you don't get a vote because voting is basically about how the money's spent. But if you're not putting any money in, you can't have a vote. Now, for those people who say, oh, well, you know, you can't do this, can't do that, it's immoral, all that kind of bullshit. What is immoral is being forced to pay for your neighbor. You're working, he's not working. Being forced to pay for your neighbor, that is immoral. And you could do it another way so that people aren't disenfranchised. You could give the wealth creator 3 votes. And the guy who isn't creating any wealth, 1 vote. And that would rebalance our society and our economies. And I think that would be at least something that should be even talked about, but these things aren't even being talked about, are they? How much longer can we go down this path of degraded currency, bankruptcy, the highest global debt ever? It's something like $270 trillion, isn't it, if you take corporate and public? These numbers are inconceivable, aren't they, to the public mind? Does anybody really understand that? You and I are in the money business. I don't understand those kind of numbers. They're miles over my head. So we've got to do something, but of course we won't do anything. It's got to get worse. And when it gets worse, what will happen? We won't have everybody saying, my goodness me, we should have been libertarians. The government have created all this mayhem because they're greedy and crooked. They won't say that. They'll say we didn't have enough government. We need a firmer government. We need a different system. We need communism, or we need fascism or something, and all the rest of it. And more police, armed police, politicized police, and more FBI, and all the rest of it. That's what's going to happen when it all collapses. And this is what's happened in history. It happened in the French Revolution. They got a new emperor. They got Napoleon. The Russians had a revolution, and they got Stalin. The Germans had a sort of revolution after the war, and they got Hitler. You don't get libertarianism, you don't get free government, you don't get a free society with a revolution. You get more of the same, and that's where we're heading.